Hello to my amazing Nipsing students. Welcome to another presentation, part two. Just took Charlotte for a walk. She's sleeping now, so I'm ready to dive back into it. So let's just pick up where we left off on the last slide. And we're gonna, if you're looking through the PowerPoint, we're about to start on the slide that's called 4 Ways of Conceptualizing Age. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so there's 4 types of ways of looking at aging, and all this kind of means is obviously there's like the biological aging, right, which we call chronological aging, which is like how many times through the calendar have you been on the planet, how many spins on this planet floating in space have you been a part of, and it's like, so how many years since birth. Then all 3 of the other ones are basically just these ways of sort of measuring against the average, right? So how healthy are you compared to other people your age? How psychologically involved and engaged and capacity wise are you compared to people your age? And then socially, how engaged, right? So it's like, for example, say my grandma was like this, so say like my grandma like still was very social when she's old, and you're like, oh, she's got like the social life of a teenager. Like if I said that, you would all know what I mean, but like, why do you understand that age comparison thing like that? Like it's because of our expectations based on social age, right? And that, so these are all just ways you could kind of measure health in ways that aren't just like literally amount of days alive or years since birth. And so at this point, I want to present this idea of like 3 ideas of aging. And basically, I'm going to say like normal, pathological, or like not normal, and then like successful. And I, I know that these have become almost loaded words, like the word normal. It's like, what do you mean normal? Like, isn't everybody normal? It's like, well, not technically, right? Because technically norm just means middle, right? And like Stanley Hall, famously the guy that created the idea of norms, it's like a norm is like what's the normal time for kids to start reading? Well, what do? You test 10,000 kids and then you just average it, and it's like that's what the norm is, and then some people do it faster and some people do it less, but there's like kind of what it's like for most people, right? So again, it's not, it's observational assessment of human behavior, not a moral judgment. And it's like that this, what normal aging is, what is influencing most individuals, right? Psychological functioning often peaks in early middle age, right? It tends to stay relatively stable until like the 50s, early 60s, tend to start to experience modest decline throughout the early 80s. Again, remember this, I'm saying this is sort of the blueprint for the average human experience. Again, things like culture and stuff don't affect this a ton because that's such a difficult question, right? Because at a certain point, what's the difference between like the word culture and the word nurture and the word environment and the word social life and the word family? Like, of course, your world influences you. This, but the point I was going to make though is that like a lot of times what you see is that people are sort of at their psychological peak in their like 40s, 50s, in their, it stays relatively stable to the 60s, starts to decline a bit once it gets into the 80s, and then there's often a steep decline at the end, which again to family and stuff can be very painful to watch, obviously. But like that's kind of what that term marked decline would mean, is like there's like a, if you were to look at it on a graph, you'd be like, whoa, look at that part, that's like way more of a decline than just the normal degeneration or whatever. It's like, yeah, like the fact that you would notice it, it means it's sort of marked, it's like noticeable, a very noticeable decline, significant would be another word. So then when we're talking about like brain pathology and we're talking about Those points came on the screen in a weird order. Tripped me out for a sec that I was going to mess up the recording. But, sorry, individuals, well, it's sometimes, basically I just said there's like the normal, and then I'm going to say here that there's sometimes it goes worse than the normal, and then sometimes it goes better than the normal, and that's sort of obvious in a way, right? Some individuals show greater than average decline early in their old age. They may have mild to severe cognitive impairment, anything from like dementia to Alzheimer's and all kinds of other things. And like Alzheimer's, I'm going to just touch on because in the second part of the course, I'll spend more time talking about late life, and I'll talk about Alzheimer's more specifically. And Alzheimer's is very interesting new research in its relation to this tau protein, like TAU. And it's so interesting of like how, since so many people are living longer and it's now affecting way more people, and if everyone somehow, if we could like improve lung and heart, because really to like stay alive longer, it's like lung, heart, brain. And if like, is it the brain that has kind of an expiry around 105 or whatever, 90? It's like obviously can change between people, but so my point I'm kind of stumbling around is, I'm not trying to be smart or whatever, I'm just saying like, is one of the reasons there's such a huge increase in Alzheimer's a reflection of people living longer and the brain not being a forever thing? That was not a smooth way of saying that. I'm going to show what I mean much better with videos and stuff like that when we actually talk about Alzheimer's, because I had a grandma with I lost when my grandma died. She was really deep in Alzheimer's, and like I know it's a very difficult topic, and I'm not going to just talk on it lightly. But it's also a very important thing to know about, because if you're in the kind of fields that you're in, you're likely, and especially if you're aware of like the demographic changes affecting society in Canada, there's going to be a lot of work with young people and a lot of work with old people, and older people, I should say, and just like the ability to add psychological value to their life is huge. There's a lot of potential, like whether you're talking about art therapies and music therapies and all kinds of stuff. All right, next slide. I think it's like useful to look at this too, and it's the pattern, or kind of the definition of successful aging, and it's pretty broad, but I think all of us, if we kind of thought about it for a while, it's like basically like, you know, being relatively healthy and being relatively like mentally engaged and interested in stuff and having a hobby, and then also like, well, that's what engagement in life, so it's kind of like being mentally sharp and then engagement with life. Because one thing we know, especially like when people are later in life and if they lose a spouse, like one of the most psychologically protective things that they can develop is like a really intense hobby, or something that's really psychologically and physically challenging and engaging. Right, and when we get to that point in the course, I'm actually going to talk about my grandpa and when my grandma died, and how like it really helped him to start this like historical society in Arthur, and it's like that hobby was very psychologically nourishing, I guess you could say. Yes, we'll talk about all this. Like this is, and again, I'm sort of outlining in this first presentation, and since it's the intro presentation, I'm sort of outlining like the whole scope of what we're going to be doing in this course, in our work together here. So in high school, you might have had, or in earlier classes even, you might have had like a debate class. I don't know, maybe they don't still do debate class, but that's good training. Or like if you had like politics, or maybe in your school they called it like human civilization, or maybe they called it, maybe some students take like a psych anthropology combo class. Anyways, in some kind of class like that, you probably came across this nature nurture, and you've just heard it, and I know that you know this idea, but I want to kind of, and it's very, effective, right? So the idea I was thinking before I started recording this slide was like aggression. Like aggression is like a classic thing you can look at from nature nurture. Like there's obvious relationship between, especially with male aggression, having a dad that's aggressive. There's that argument to be made that there's a biological component to temper is about as easy of a biological argument to make about any behavioral trait of humans. However, at the same time, how someone's raised obviously affects their aggression levels. So there's nature and nurture components, but then we can sometimes get too much into this. Is it one or the other? What is it? Which is it? And it's like, I think the more accurate way of thinking about it is like, how are each of these, the kid's born, so say like there's a, say you're born with more of a predisposition towards temper, because that's really what we're talking about. It's not like every person that has a bad temper has kids that have bad tempers. But we know that the likelihood is higher than average. Right, so one of the points I'm going to be making is sometimes it's like, and I know I got kind of lost on my ramble there, but my point is that the nature nurture thing is actually a really helpful way of thinking deeply and getting into the topic. And then, but the last step also has to always be like stepping back and being like, obviously our nature is in nurture, right? Like it almost sounds silly saying it. It's like I'm a physical body in a world. It's like hard to say like, well, what is my physical body and what is the world? It's like, it's almost like what's the character and what's the movie? It's like, they're so interdependent. They're the same thing, sort of. But then it's like interesting because you can talk about that if you're looking at like, say, how a child's going through certain things. You can look at like how much of this is being caused by sort of under the waves biological influences, and then how much of it is learning environment based. So there's like definitely a value in talking about it. Biology and learning. So developmental psychology, I think, is one field that really sort of demands, what am I trying to say here? Demands respect for both sides of this argument, because it's so core to what developmental psychology is saying. Like, something is a thing that develops. That thing, what it is, matters. The nature of it matters. How it develops is part of its nature, but obviously the environment it's in shapes that. So you can see like everything in developmental psych is nature nurture. It's the study of nature nurture in relation to human development. You and your world. So just in case you're sitting there being like, okay, well, that was like the wordiest definition of nature nurture of all time, let me just give you a real kind of specific way of saying it, that nature's an organism's biological inheritance. Nurture is environmental experiences. Some of those environmental experiences could be parenting, could be the school you're in, could be the media you're exposed to, could be the dating scenarios you've been in, could be the work experiences and the school experiences that you've been in, could be the religion you've been exposed to. All those kind of things are nurture. I think I already said media, but that's such a huge one, right? And then like, so again, I'm just kind of making this point that sometimes we're going to go the different paths because it's really interesting, right? It's like interesting to look at these different aspects of, as opposed to start talking about mice and how they experience stress. But I think I'm going to save some of the, I have a problem of staying on the slide, as you may have already learned. So I'm going to try to keep working on that. Okay. Nature, nurture, one more slide on that. It's interesting recording like this, right? Because it's like, it seems maybe too like it's like just continuous, but like it's kind of interesting recording throughout the day. We were talking about this nature nurture idea, right? And I wanted to say like this is just a bit more language that's used about this, like this idea of stability and change, right? Like why do we have Why do some things and some behavioral patterns, for example, stay stable over long periods of time, and why is there such change in some areas? And well, some of that's because of differing environmental and situational influences in nurture, and some of that's like because of this kind of under the waves changes that are happening at a biological level. These words continue, like to continue, or continuity and discontinuity. Is sometimes interesting to talk about, like, are things kind of gradually changing, or is there like these huge jumps? We're going to talk about this in terms of like, well, just like how a kid's not just like a less smart adult, they're actually using like Piaget would say a sensory motor way of perceiving the world, right? And it's like very different than adult thinking. It's like a whole different kind of thinking. It's not just less of adult thinking. And that's a way of talking about this word qualitative difference. That's a qualitative difference. So I have here for an example of qualitative difference, like identity. Like it's easy for you to probably think that like the identity, how you saw yourself when you were 5 and how you see yourself now and how you see yourself when you're 85, it's going to be different. It's going to be influenced by different things. It's not more or less in a number. The same way that, like, say if I say like, you know, the average height of females in Canada has changed almost, you know, from 5'2" to 5'4". That's like a very, like, you can measure that. That's quantitative. You can quantify it. You can put a number to it. So later in the course, we'll talk about, you know, during this part yet, we'll talk about this idea called the social facilitation effect. And this is this like interesting idea that basically, like, say I was in a contest and it was like how many glasses of water I can drink in 2 minutes, or how many push-ups I could do in a minute or something. And all of you were standing around in a circle and you're chanting like, Mike, Mike, Mike. It's like I could probably do better with that social encouragement. But as soon as you increase the cognitive complexity of the task, right? So as soon as, if it was writing a paper, or not even a paper, but if I had 2 minutes to write the best paragraph and everyone's around me, Mike, 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 not just that it would be distracting, that pressure would actually hurt my performance. That's called social facilitation theory. So it's this idea that, like, encouragement from spectators in your immediate vicinity can help performance on certain tasks and actually hurts performance on more cognitively challenging tasks. What is that? That's a set of interrelated ideas that's used to try to explain some situation and also make predictions about other situations. So we could assume then with that idea that, you know, if I put you in a time pressure situation and got you to do chin-ups, that would show that you could do more than you could. Because just think about it, right? It's like, the point is basically that social pressure, if what you're doing is very physical and straightforward, that social pressure wanting to do good with people watching you will actually make you do a bit more. But if it's challenging, that social pressure is actually interfering with your cognitive, the sharpness of your cognitive functioning, and it's actually creating distortion and noise, and it actually hurts your performance. So that's a theory that's actually not just one idea, because a lot of times in society now people will call something a theory, but it's really just a proposition. It's just a piece of a theory. Like, a theory is something that actually is something you can use, that kind of a set of ideas to try to explain something and yet make predictions about other situations. It usually is used to suggest a hypothesis, something testable. Like, we could create a testable situation. You could, to prove or disprove my situation. You know, the scientific method. And this goes back to yeah, see, that tripped me out because I pressed down once and nothing did happen. I didn't want to mess with the slide. Anyways, it was a 4-step process, right? This is like classically attributed to Francis Bacon and is like a huge part of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and this idea of like actually we can have this structured approach to science, right? And that the structured approach to science is basically develop ideas that are in this, like, develop concepts that are then turned into testable hypotheses, and then we can, like, study that thing and see if your hypothesis is true and see if we can disprove it. And this is why a guy named Karl Popper and his idea around falsification, like, something's true if you can't prove that it's not true. It's true enough to be theory until it can be challenged by even better, maybe, information, and that's kind of what the development of science and knowledge is. there's a conceptualization of a problem or something to be studied, then you collect information about it, then you analyze that information, then you make conclusions about it, and then you see if you were right, and maybe you're back to the drawing board. And I kind of have it mapped out on this next slide. So this is obviously pretty simple. I know that maybe some of you have already taken like research methodology, or maybe at Nipsey they call it research design or methodologies or something like that. But it's all just like, what's your method of doing research, right? What's your design of doing research? You're asking questions. Those questions are like, maybe why are people acting in this certain way, whatever the situation is, and then you have your ideas about why it might be, and then you make an experiment to test those ideas, and then you find your results from that, and then maybe it supports your hypothesis, and you report that, or it doesn't, and you report that because it's interesting too. Like in the generation of research, it's interesting when studies are wrong, because especially if they're reported honestly, because well, a major way of finding the medicine that works is finding first all the ones that don't. And it's like, that's kind of what this bigger contribution of knowledge is. And then it's back to the drawing board, right, which is represented sort of by the green arrows, to reassess the underlying fundamental research questions and relook at the hypothesis. And that this is kind of the method of science, the scientific method. So one of the reasons I'm talking about this is because developmental psychology sort of starts with Freud and this, and the starting of psychology in general, right? And it's like a lot of people will give you different dates. If you ask me, I would say the birth of psychology is basically when Freud published his Interpretation of Dreams in 1899. It's like, that's when he develops or comes out with the idea of the unconscious. It's like, that idea changes everything, and I'm going to talk about it on the next slide. But let's look at some of these major theories of development. And these theories aren't like something like Freud's theory of psychoanalytics. It's not like, or psychodynamics, and psychoanalytics is sort of the study of psychodynamics. And it's like, that's a massive idea, that you have an unconscious mind that has a huge influence on your experience of your life, especially at an emotional level. So let's look at some of these major theories. So if you get this first definition, right? So I'm kind of like trying to do this presentation with the understanding that you're probably watching and taking notes. And so I'm going to kind of like give, I think I kind of, just from teaching live a lot of times in other classes, like I think my pace is, I'll try to like keep my pace so that I'm kind of putting up stuff and giving you time to write, but also time to like not have to be super intense the whole time. Because I want you to kind of take in these ideas, like look at that tree picture for a second, and the idea of like the reflection containing even more essence and being bigger. And on the next slide, I'm going to show the classic like iceberg, which is always used with Freud, and that's like the best one, because it's like most of the iceberg's underwater, and that's being used to symbolize the mind, and that so many things that influence us are things that even if I gave you all the time in the world, you'd have trouble explaining to me. It's like why certain people rub you the wrong way, or why certain people you're instantly attracted to, or why some people, you know, because it's weird. It's weird why everyone doesn't have the same reaction to people. We all have this like, and it's because we're all playing the sensory information that comes into our brain off different memory banks, is one of the reasons. And Freud's looking at this idea of like how these things that we might not be able to articulate, like early lifehood experiences that were negative, and that we might not remember the actual memory, but the energy still exists from that. Energy sometimes comes out and makes us act in ways that don't seem emotionally appropriate to our current situation, especially as adults, and especially in the area of anxiety. It's like, I don't believe the people that want to throw away Freud. It's like, it's easy to list the things he was wrong about. He wrote, well, it's not super easy. It's not a ton of them. He wrote a ton of books. He was making up the field sort of as he went. Almost everyone after Freud is responding to Freud, either critiquing or like either it's like a Karen Horney, who's like probably one of the most articulate opponents of Freud, even though she was like a friend and maintained professionalism, which I super respect about that aspect of the psychoanalytic story. Karen Horney is maybe the first feminist psychologist. And then, even though she probably wouldn't have self-identified as that, maybe, I'm not sure, I'd have to look at it. But she, in hindsight, would definitely be considered that. Or someone like Otto Rank, who was like a hardcore defender. So there's a lot of people coming after. It's like kind of like the equivalent that I would think of would be like Shakespeare to literature. It's like it's hard to miss that contribution because it was so essential to the foundation. Freud thought that a lot of our behavior was almost like a surface reflection of something smaller. I mean, something bigger that was under the waves. Like that term there, behavior, is a surface characteristic, that the true understanding of development requires this analysis, this psychoanalysis, right? Psycho, like the beginning of the word psychology, the psyche, psychoanalysis, the analysis of your mind, of your psyche. That true understanding of development requires an analysis of the symbolic meaning of behavior and the deep workings of the mind. I also think that Freud is better understood if you keep in mind that the language of genetics wasn't around when Freud was writing. People weren't talking a lot about things like DNA and chromosomes until like the 20s and 30s. Guys like Arnold Giselle in like the early 20s was like one of the first people. And keep in mind, Freud's doing a lot of this writing in the late 1890s and in the early 1900s. So some of these things he talks about, like these drives and all these things, it's like now we would just understand them as like biological realities. A lot of them, right? And not saying every single thing Freud said is right, but it's a good starting assumption. And then there's some areas where it was wrong, but I mean, to say he was an intellectual heavyweight's not saying enough. All right, you can tell I'm a Freud fan, whatever. Some of your teachers will dump on Freud, I assume, but I think that, like, I would argue it. Okay, anyways, next slide. And just to continue my rant from the last slide, right, like this is the classic picture. This is the classic Freudian contribution. It's like one of the biggest ideas in the history of ideas. Like, I don't know, it's relativity, natural selection. It's like there's not many ideas as groundbreaking as that. There's things that influence who you are and how you're making sense of your world that you're not aware of, that are unconscious to you. They're like definitionally not conscious to you. You could not tell me about it. You could not sit and think about it. You can't. Well, Freud thought that you could get to it through dreams and through hypnosis. And sometimes Carl Jung thought art could do it, in certain forms of, again, what he called active imagination, which is like a hypnotic daydream almost. It's like, and he thought one of the reasons is because there's these defense mechanisms that, and this is then this defense mechanisms idea, which you've probably heard of, gets really picked up by Anna Freud, and another absolute giant in psychology, Freud's daughter. One of the biggest names in psychology, easily. All right, so Freud. So there's Freud for you. One of the most commonly utilized psychological theories in developmental psychology is definitely psychosocial, and this idea is Erikson's. And Erikson's an interesting person because if you look down there, it's like he actually has like a really interesting story, because he wasn't like a university psych student who was like always interested in this stuff. He was actually like struggling with stuff himself and experienced a positive experience with psychoanalysis, and became an analyst himself and kind of threw himself into it. And see at the bottom it says, even though he lacked a bachelor's degree, eventually by the end of his career he's like a professor at Harvard and Yale, which are two of the more prestigious schools in the States, right? It's interesting to think that he's like a friend of Freud's sister or daughter, one of Freud's daughters. Erickson's where we get the idea of like identity crisis and trust issues and all this idea that like the pressures that are on us and that shape the development of our psychology, that our psychology's development, is shaped by all these social pressures, this psychosocial model of how we develop. And so as we move through the course here, we'll these points come on this slide in a weird order. There's the picture. Okay. So I was just going to give this as an example, right? That, yeah, humans, okay, so these first 3 points are like general points about the psychosocial idea that humans develop in psychosocial stages. So again, like if some of learning psychology is just like learning the specific terms, right? So psychosocial obviously is just a combination of the word psychology and social. And it's just saying that like, well, the baby's mind and the baby's development of a trust relationship with mom, it's kind of hard to say like what's a baby's what does a baby trusting its mom mean? Right, because it's not the same as like you trusting your friend. It's so much deeper. It's like a survival-based biological genetic trust. And Erickson's idea is actually so deep because his idea is that like if there's a failure to develop a strong sense of mother responsiveness that's appropriate and time sensitive and survival based, that the baby can actually start to think that the world's not safe, and that thinking that the world is not safe can be internalized. We'll talk about this more in the course later, but that by the time a child's like 4 or 5, they basically created their internal model of the world. This is jumping ahead a bit and getting into Piaget, but his idea is that basically by the time you're like 4 or 5, the kid has this idea of sort of who they are. This model, right? A model of a plane is not the actual plane, it's a model of it. It's not who they actually are, it's a model of it. And that a big thing that shapes that is how much they feel like in this story or movie of their life that the character that they play can trust things. Again, it's not like the kid could articulate it or explain it. Erickson would say this is at a deep psychosocial core to the being level, in the same way that like, so trust, mistrust, that's like, just I'm using 2 examples here, that's like the first stage. So that's when we're talking about babies. And then intimacy and isolation I threw on purpose because this is kind of probably the stage a lot of you are in, where it's like 20s and 30s, and Erickson would say a lot of the struggle for you is like developing intimacy. And he said like don't be like fooled into thinking that just means romantically, because yeah, it means dating, and but not just dating, but like dating in a way that you feel like you're being true to yourself, and that like that's healthy, I guess, and that like it has an emotional depth. Because he thought isolation, like he thought that you could like very much be like dating someone and be completely psychologically isolated. He didn't think it meant like physical presence necessarily, just like you could probably have like a long distance relationship with someone that's like really deep. So he thought that like intimacy and isolation was talking about the psychological depth of relationship. But just to continue that point, he also thought that like a huge part of that was friendship and meaningful work and meaningful engagement with things like teams or associations, or that all these things are like big goals of your 20s and 30s, is basically deciding like who are the human beings that are going to be part of the experience of your life, and then cultivating those relationships so that they're as high quality as they can be, because that's what will nourish you. I feel deja vu, like I already said a very similar point, but yeah, that's like Erickson's idea. So another example of a theory would be like this idea that you've probably come across of Skinner's. Right, Skinner may be the most famous of the behavioralists and of the learning theorists, along with like Thorndike and Pavlov and Watson. And this idea that like behaviors learned through interactions with the surroundings, that actually the consequences of the behavior shape the behavior. So if you know that you're going to get a positive reaction to doing something, that shapes whether you post it or whether you do it or whatever. And if you think that the reaction is going to be negative, that also shapes that the positive or negative, the reward or punishment. If we're talking about the rat experiment, it's like the more basic point is that if you know what's going to happen, or if you at least have the ability to foresight potential different scenarios, that obviously affects what you do. That behavior is operantly conditioned. It's conditioned almost this backwards way through a knowledge of consequence. Behavioralism is this idea that, yes, scientifically, only what can be directly observed and measured. It's looking at development as observed. Development is observable behavior learned through experience with the environment. Yeah, so I got like kind of technical with his writing, but it's like that is what it means. That it's very much looking at how can you use, because Watson famously said, like, give me any kid and I can make him a soldier or a plumber or a doctor. I forget specifically the 3 jobs he picked, but basically what he's saying is like, and that's, you'll notice that about me, it's like I'm pretty decent at like pulling from random things, but like I won't have it word for word. But I think he said soldier, doctor, and plumber. But what's he basically saying? Like, I can train them. I basically have to just create the correct learning environment to sequentially, boom, 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 step by step, shape their behavior to the point that they're, you know, what the end goal is. That learning is conditioning, and that conditioning is environment based. So you can see this is like hardcore on the nurture side of the conversation we were having earlier. So you already know this, but I wanted to, and I know that, like, although I won't apologize for it because I think it's important to break down terms. I think sometimes we can get comfortable with language because we've heard it a bunch of times, but it's still important to slow down and realize, like, okay, when we're talking about cognitive, we're talking about the kind of work that your brain does. We're talking about how intelligence plays out, how it actually plays out. We're not necessarily talking about IQ. We're talking about like used intelligence. We're talking about how you use language. Like, for example, if you're in cognitive psychology, you might be very interested in the fact that like how you're talking is heavily influenced by your memory, right? So like your ability to understand my language is heavily influenced by your real-time ability to like remember what individual words mean and string it together in such fast speed that you're just hearing me live. And like my ability to talk to you is basically me being able to do the opposite of like thinking my ideas, and my brain's basically like giving me the next word in the sentence that I'm just rambling and running on right now, and it's blah 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 blah. But it's like that's all cognitive application of language based on my memory, right? And it's like, well, how did I know what the word application meant and that I should use it there? And it's like, well, that's just all real-time applied memory. That's why your active memory sometimes is the term, but it's like memory coming forward, informing your in the moment experience, informing what you're paying attention to and what you're perceiving. So it's it's your conscious. It's not just your conscious. I don't want to say that. It's the work that your brain does. It's the applying of your intelligence. It's the use and the everything around language. It's everything around thinking and problem solving and weighing consequences. It's your perception of how things are related to each other, and even visual perception, right? Like a huge part of your psychological system is related to vision. Well, a whole part, not just your psychological system, your brain system, I should have said. Okay, so, and I don't need you to write this down, okay? Because we're going to be doing Piaget throughout this course. He's, in my opinion, probably the most important developmental psychologist. We'll be touching on his work quite a bit. But, so don't worry about like writing down sensory, motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, formal operational. We'll get to that. But based on the rant I was just going on, this is kind of what I was trying to set up, like all those things, like how we use intelligence, how we use language, how we use memory, and all this stuff. Piaget thought that like those went through stages of development. You'll hear me rant about this later, that like Piaget was helping the guy that developed the IQ test, and Piaget's job was to record the wrong answers that kids gave, and he was noticing that kids tended to give similar wrong answers, right? So that when people answered the questions wrong, it wasn't as random as you would think, that there seemed to be like a pattern of wrong answers, and that pattern of wrong answers seemed to be associated with the age of the kid. And so he started to basically notice that kids of a certain age tended to answer the wrong in the same way. And so he started to So it's kind of interesting that his work on helping the guy develop the IQ test, by far the most famous psychometric ever created, by far, the Stanford Binet IQ. The only thing even close is Big Five personality, and that's not even close. And so he was working on that huge test, right? And we'll talk about IQ later in the course and all the stuff about it. But like, it's kind of interesting to note that how he came up with his idea was noticed by being the one that's recording all the wrong answers and noticing there's a pattern to those wrong answers, and that pattern of wrong answering was actually a reflection of differences in how they were processing the question based on these different stages of cognitive development, which later becomes his idea, that they're actually making sense of the situation differently. And Piaget, you're going to hear me like rant a bit about Piaget in this course, because I think he might be both the most important developmental psychologist and the most unhyped, like the most underrated, maybe is the term, psychologist. So deep, and he had this idea that they had children go through this different development in their conscious thought, and that children are constructing this personal understanding. It's like, well, what does that mean? It's like, well, did you ever feel like it felt like your life was a movie that you were the character in? Even when you were a kid, you never thought that it's like life sort of just because we're these like biological organisms that stand straight up and we have two eyes that most of our experience is visual. It's like not that weird that there's an aspect of life that feels like it's a first person perspective movie of your own life. It's like they're constructing this understanding of the world and their place in it, and this is a deeply cognitive process. And that at different stages of their ability to make sense of themselves and their world, they're at these almost like different levels of understanding, and therefore like their ability to make sense of certain things is different. And it's different qualitatively, and that just means it's not like a 5-year-old is like a 20 out of 100 at doing it, and an 8-year-old is like a 60 out of 100. It's like that's not right, because that's just saying it's like more or less the same thing. This is what we were saying a bit earlier, that a qualitative difference means like my baby's making sense of her world mainly through her visual system and her movement. She's not using like logic at all. So to say she's like, to judge her based on her use of, well, to say she's not using logic, that's not right. She's not using abstract thinking, right? That's a better example, because she's starting to use basic logic like she is. Like she can, to say that she uses no logic is actually wrong. But I think I would switch my example to like abstract thought, like a baby's not engaged in like thinking about the future and detailed plans for her like life the way like my 6-year-old is, right? Different stage of development, different whole way of thinking. It's not just, and I know I'm rambling like crazy, but I mean like it's not just more or less of an attribute of a video game character. Like now all of a sudden cognition is an increased score. It's like it would have to be a whole different thing. It's like a different level. It's like you get to this level and then it moves to the, goes from the red to the blue to the green to the yellow or something like that, and you're going up stages of cognitive development. So Vygotsky's idea here of, and this is a Russian psychologist, very interesting, maybe the most famous Russian psychologist. Pavlov was Russian, but Pavlov was more of a, what do you call him, a physiologist, right? He's an expert in salivation. Just his findings around classical conditioning have so much relevance for psychology, but Vygotsky was a scientist, a psychologist, and he was very interested in this idea of learning, right? And how people learn, and how you can actually create learning environments where it's like, okay, this is what you're able to do, but how can you with help be able to do something more? The example that students sometimes like is I used this a few weeks ago. I was talking to some students at Conestoga, because I do an intro, I guess it was just last week, I do like an intro psychology lecture where I sort of touch on a little bit of all of the main foundational kind of theorists in psychology, and I came to Vygotsky, and I was making this point that, like, when my daughter plays Minecraft, sometimes as she's playing, screens will come up and she'll have to like get out of the screen, and if it's got a lot of reading on it, sometimes she'll need me to like figure out if she just needs to close it or if she needs to press like continue or whatever, right? So like the point I'm making though is if I'm sitting there helping her, I can like easily help her with that, and then she can keep playing. But without that help, she wouldn't be able to keep going. And the idea is that like sometimes kids are able to achieve more with a little bit of help than they could by themselves, and that's sort of obvious. But that Vygotsky got really interested in studying that specifically, and he viewed that as the zone of development, that there's actually like what you can do by yourself and what you can do with help, and that with the best trained help in the world helping you in the best possible way, maybe you can do this, and maybe with no help you can do this, and this whole space in the middle is your potential growth area, your zone of proximal development, the place where you could experience growth. That's your learning environment, right? So we thought that, like, for example, if I was going to teach, if say I wanted to teach grade ones how to read, and I show up with like Macbeth, it's like that's way too hard. Or if I show up to all of you and I have like the Bernstein Bears or whatever my kids read, it's like that's way too easy. It's like I have to actually know what level you're at and then model a little bit better than where you're at, but that's within your reach, and that's how you actually make people improve. That's how you actually train. That's what ZPD means. So Vygotsky believed that culture and social interaction guide cognitive development. So what's he mean by that? That through your interaction with your environment, your social interaction, and through your culture, and just like what your culture is going to shape what that environment is, that's part of your cognitive development. That the child wanting to speak with the older kids actually motivates the child to learn language. It's inseparable from the environment in which it happens. That actually cognitive development is related to learning to sort of use the tools of your society, right? And some of those tools are language or math or how to use your memory. That social interaction with more skilled adults and peers is indispensable to cognitive development, right? It's like a key thing. It's like almost irreplaceable. Like when you can actually see the next step in your development modeled by a skilled peer who's maybe either older or more advanced at whatever skill we're talking about, like reading or sports or writing or whatever. So cognitive psychologists and cognitive scientists have went through this stage of this real kind of attraction of explaining things in terms of computation, and it makes sense that this idea of the human mind as a computer, there are aspects that are useful metaphorically or like useful symbolically, I guess I mean, or like as illustrations of some of these processes, and you'll see in a second this information processing theory. But I want you to kind of think about the history that's kind of interesting. It's like as computers are sort of emerging into people's consciousness in like, I don't know, the 50s, 60s, and like because computers don't really become a household thing until like the mid 80s, like late 80s, even maybe even early 90s, depending on your family, right? Like it wasn't in, I don't even remember having my first laptop until probably university. In high school, my school had computers, and I think my mom had a computer for work. But like the change has been so fast, and so it made people think of like how the brain processes information, and because now all of a sudden we're creating these like silicon-based like chips, right, and that are able to process information. And so the comparison is kind of interesting, and I'm going to go into it more on the next slide here. Okay, information processing theory. So here we go, right? That individuals manipulate information, monitor it, strategize about it, that it's like, but again, I want you to just notice this point of like the comparison to computations, or like you fire things into the computer and it does things for you. It's like that your brain's this thing that works through information processing. It computes, it manipulates, it stores, it monitors, it strategizes. That this is kind of a perspective that views development as less stage-like and more like this development of skill set, that as this individual's, like, I'll just read this part, that the individual develops this gradually increasing capacity to deal with more and more information. And like the smarter way to say that would be like, as you're getting older, you're getting a more and more complex memory system, and so that changes your day-to-day experience, because as you go through your world, you're being exposed to things and people and events and things, and you're playing that off what you've already experienced. And it's like this model of the world is getting higher and higher resolution and definition, and it's you in the movie of your life. It's your subjective perspective, and that this is actually everything that we understand is like kind of your mental work or your mental activity or your information processing could be understood as a computer. Again, I'm not trying to tell you that this is how I would view it now. I'm just saying that there's this like kind of movement within psychology of talking especially about things like memory, and memory probably is the most logical one, right? Like how we like encode information and then store it and then retrieve it. There's similarities to obviously how you store files, except that that's misleading because you don't actually store memory in one place. Because think of like some charged event in your life. It's like that memory has emotional aspects too, and it might even have physical aspects if you were involved in it personally and moving and stuff. And so that's like that memory spread all around your brain in different areas. So the file idea of computers is actually quite misleading in some sense, right? Because we have memory is just a really complicated thing that we'll talk about throughout the course. So I hope you enjoy this class. Like, I know I'm a little bit, maybe, I don't know if I'm being like too casual or whatever, but look at me being all like self-conscious all of a sudden. I can only be myself. So social cognitive theory of Bender is kind of interesting, right? So Bender, and you've probably heard this. I'm just trying to kind of tell the story of some of the major characters, I guess, or players in this field of emerging field of developmental psych, and Bender is definitely one. Bender has this idea that it's called reciprocal determinism, that like one thing influences the other, which influences the other. Like, so determinism would mean that one thing determines another, but when the arrow is going both ways, that means it's reciprocal or going both ways determinism, that your behavior shapes the type of person you are, but the type of person you are shapes your behavior, and your behavior shapes your environment, but then your environment responds differently to you based on your behavior. And so that these things are all in this dynamic interaction, and that your behavior and your environment and who you are as a person are these key aspects, your kind of cognitive, who you are. And then this is where it's so interesting. I know I'm ranting, but like Bender is worth a rant because he has this interesting point that it's almost useful to externalize your behavior as a third thing here and look at this as this interaction between the world you live in, who you are, and then how you're acting as a response to that. Because he thought that like one of the interesting things is that like you notice what you do, right? And this is like a major problem that people deal with when they're dealing with like depression, is that this is why it's important not to do and say weak things, because we see ourselves do it and it shapes how we see ourselves, and that influences our future behavior. So it's not just other people that see our behavior and change how they see us. We see our behavior at this deep individualized level, right? So Bender really, and I have there, if you're wondering why I have the Bobo doll there, like the kid hitting the doll, right? The famous Bender finding is that like you can have an adult hitting the doll and then have the kid exposed to the doll, and the kid tends to mimic what the adult does, right? And so that's very interesting. And he basically was showing that people can learn observationally, and Bandura was at the time very actually I have the idea right here. Yeah, that he linked our environment and our behavior, that our behavior is actually like It's not that it's not us. It's almost like our pattern of engagement with the world. He called this like a social cognitive model. It's pretty deep, and as I was going to say this a second ago, but as Bandura is coming up with his ideas, it's like very timely because people are starting to get just like computers in the last example, people are starting to get TVs in the house, right? And so the question becomes, well, okay, if you can learn from others, then what about all this like sexualized and aggressive content that we all see through media? Does that sexualize and make people more aggressive? It's like an age-old question, right? Like, do video games affect behavior? Because it's like clearly there's not no effect, right? But like millions of kids play games like Call of Duty, and the amount of kids that do things that are violent is so small that like if it's to make a cause-effect claim is pretty tough. But then to make a claim that like your media consumption doesn't affect your thinking would be almost foolish. So, or not almost foolish, it'd be clearly foolish, right? Like obviously what the stimulus that you put in, that your sense organs bring in, create influence. The question is just like what influence, right? And to what level, and like how do we like balance things? And it's like, yeah, one thing influences us, but like a million things influence us, and there's cross influences and counter influences and canceling influences. And so, a good question just becomes a circle, because it's like, oh, you actually hit on something that's interesting. Like, does TV affect you? It's like, I would say yes, but how is like the $1,000,000 question. And the next question is like, and so what should we do about that? It's kind of like that Social Dilemma movie, right? If you've seen that, it's like, it's wild to think about Instagram and stuff like that, and how much it's like targeted at young girls, and like how much we know that that's terrible for their psychology, but it's still like just permitted anyways, even though it's like clearly for commercial reasons. It's like one of the weirdest things we do as a society. So this next idea, and again, remember, I'm just sort of hitting you with some of the key people and also terms. For this one, I'm going to focus more just on a kind of more broad look at it. A famous person in this area would definitely be someone like John Bowlby, and we'll be looking at Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, who's from the University of Toronto, very famous psychologist, and their ideas around attachment will be an example of ethology, or an ethological look at things, right? That's just like saying, like, what can we learn from the animal world? It's like, what can the study of other mammals teach us about things like mate selection, or things like parenting, or like how can we learn from how ducks prime to their mother, and what's that show about this? Like, because what does it actually mean for a duck to like identify something as mom? That's like the most meaningful and significant psychological variable they have, and that's actually called imprinting. And if a duck doesn't do it within a certain time, its ability to have a mom, it's just lost. And that's actually an interesting example that I sometimes use to talk about another idea in developmental psych that's called like critical periods. How like there's critical periods for certain things of development, just how there's like critical times during pregnancy when the placenta is especially sensitive to alcohol. So it's like not everything is equal. Let me say that differently. There's times in the pregnancy where the developing baby is more sensitive to alcohol. What I meant to say about the placenta, I kind of said that wrong. But ethanol can get through the placenta, so that's why drinking is dangerous when someone's pregnant. It has to do with, it actually is very chemistry based, which I guess that's obvious. We're obviously talking about chemicals. But that the study of, so like what we can learn from studying animals, and if you haven't noticed already, and I guess I haven't really talked about it yet, but that's like a huge area of interest of mine. I'm very interested in animal psychology, animals in general, especially like the I almost said the great animals. I got stuck between like the large mammals and the great apes. I was gonna say like, I'm really interested obviously in chimps and orangutans and dolphins and even the intelligence that's exhibited by things like ravens and some of the birds of prey. And then even crows, right? And then like even just different expressions, or octopus, I didn't say, that's another like almost alien type of intelligence. Like so much of an octopus's intelligence are in the arms. The arms are actually making decisions that aren't going to a central processor like a brain. It's like there's so much expressions of intelligence in nature that can help us understand elements of human reality. Of course, there are other aspects of the same natural world that we're in. How's that for a random rant? Okay, part two, point two, stress that behavior is strongly influenced by biology and tied to evolution, of course. So like one thing that might be an interesting point for you to write down is like we develop throughout a lifetime, we evolve over lifetimes. So evolution and development are like, would two sides of the same coin be the right saying? They're like the same thing, but the difference is time scale, right? All your ancestors, evolution happened across all of your ancestors until you, but then within your life you develop. But if you have kids and they 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 have kids, that time that you were alive, you would still say that there was evolution over that time. So it's confusing, but it's interesting, right? There a lot of Another way you could say it is developmental psychology is what we see when we look at people, that they tend to start talking at a certain time, that they tend to pair off in dating situations, that blah blah blah, all these things tend to happen. And then if you ask the why question, so developmental psychology is the what. If you ask the why is it like that? Why do kids start talking at this time? Why does this happen? Why is puberty like this? Why? Then those are all evolutionary questions, right? Because those are all things that to answer the why, you have to say, well, that's existed for a really long time. Some of these things like sexual reproduction, or I was hearing someone say this the other day, that like sexual reproduction is older than trees, right? And like, so mammals or not necessarily mammals, just sexual reproduction in general. It's really, my mind gets blown by stuff like that. The other thing that like my mind started to think of, like if I messed up my stat, because I like heard that recently, but the other thing that people say that's mind blowing is that like sharks are older than trees. Like, don't quote me on this because you'd have to Google it, but I think trees have been on Earth for like 30 million years or 35 million years or something, and sharks it's like 50. So it's like sharks have been around longer than trees. That's kind of wild. Anyways, it's getting late at night. I'm starting to make weird random points, so I'll try to stick to the slide. The critical and sensitive periods, that's when I was talking about earlier about like the duck priming. And this is where it's like, yeah, this idea that there's specific times that like if that duck is presented to you can have a pet duck. And actually, I bet you one of you have had one, because usually when I teach this class live, I'll be like, and I bet you one of you have a pet duck, and everyone like laughs, and I'm like, no, honestly, have any of you had a pet duck? And almost every time people do. In a group of 80 people, you can almost be guaranteed that one of them as a kid had a pet duck. And it's because you can have a pet duck. If say you live on a farm, or say if you even live in a city and you come across a duck with maybe the mother's been killed in some scenario or whatever, and the duck imprints on you, it'll follow you around. We actually had in Kitchener, we lived in downtown Kitchener, and my brother because we had an uncle that had a farm, had a chick, like a baby chicken, imprint onto him. Its name was Rascal, and it lived with us for a while in the city. And my brother would like walk around in downtown Kitchener, kind of with like a little chicken following him. It thought he was mom. Those birds, and this is where imprinting is different than attachment, which we're going to talk about, like what humans do, which is much more. Sorry, I can see that I'm almost 8 minutes on this slide, but that what imprinting is it's just much more direct. It's like it'll imprint on anything. You can see a duck will imprint on anything that's moving in its environment. It could imprint on a remote control car or a balloon or a human being or a cat. Its brain's designed to the first thing that's bigger than it that moves is mom. And if it doesn't get something to latch that to in that early time, if it doesn't get a mom, it loses the concept of mom. And that's a sensitive or critical period. Okay, so there's a picture. Here we go. Okay, so with this Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory. Now, you don't need to draw this. I'm going to do a few slides on this, but I think once you kind of get your head around what this is saying, it's actually not as complicated as it looks. If you basically picture you're in the orange in the middle, right? It's like you're the individual, and you have your own individual level characteristics, but then around you, you have your kind of specific social world at the kind of micro level, and then there's like the mesosystem, or this, I'll explain that in a second. And then there's kind of like the bigger social group around you, and then there's like the culture that you live in, and there's also the time period you live in. And what he's trying to in this picture show sorry, if you wonder what I'm looking at, it's like I have it in presenter mode so I can like see what it will look like if I press the button one more time, and I'm just trying to not go to the next slide. But these are the 5 things, right? So I'm going to do a slide on each of these words, but all I want you to think of is it's basically saying like, okay, you're who you are, and then you went to a certain school and had certain family and certain peers and certain maybe church influences and certain neighborhood play area. You had your own like little social world, and around that you had certain neighbors and the friends of your family and even the media you were exposed to and the services in your community and even the legal aspect of your community. And then around that you lived in a certain culture and society that had certain ideas and attitudes and politics and all that kind of stuff. And then in addition to that, the green at the bottom, chrono system, remember chrono, time, chronological, it means time. And so you also, not only do you live your own life in your own little world that's like in a specific time period, you're not living in the 50s and you're not living in the 2050s, 1950s, or you're not living in the past or future is what I meant by that. Yeah, I just had a weird thought there that I'll share with you. It's like, because I was just saying that 50s thing, and I was like, yeah, you know how you talk about like the 30s or the 40s or the 20s, and it's like gonna be weird. You don't really say the teens, right? So it'll be weird once we get to like 2030, and then if you're talking about the 20s, you could mean the 2020s or the 1920s. It's like never in my life has that been an issue, I guess, until I don't know. Maybe that's a weird point. Maybe that I didn't need to make, but it is kind of interesting. Okay, let's break it. Let me get through Bronfenbrenner's model here, and then we'll be pretty much good for the day. I want to say like a few points about Maslow and a few other people, but he said that this microsystem, right, that it's setting in the setting, right, the environment or the place, the setting. That's like an interesting word, right? That like you're a biological being that's been set in a certain place, and that setting matters. It includes like the family and the peers in the school, and as well as like your biological makeup physically and cognitively. Now, this is like, this says their most direct interactions are going to be with other agents or other people, you could say, or other individuals within that microsystem, right? So the majority of your life, yeah, you're influenced by people that you interact with, but it's not all equal. That, you know, obviously, like your parents and the people that are your teachers, and maybe the parents of your friends, and like maybe a coach that you have, like those are going to be the adults in the, maybe a leader at church, those are going to be the adults in the community that have a disproportional influence on you, kind of obviously, right? Your closer system that individual is. The individual isn't like a passive recipient of experiences. It's an interesting way of saying it, that like the person isn't just completely neutral. They're playing a role, right? And that's kind of obvious, right? That like as you engage your environment, you become part of your environment for other people, right? And it's like my social world at school is all the people in the class, but to the people in the class, I'm one of the people in the class, so I'm part of that social world from their perspective. It's like kind of wild, but interesting idea. So another idea here is this idea of the mesosystem. So you can see here it's represented as, you know, the individual is orange, and then around them is the microsystem, like we were just talking about, like the closest social relationships. But then there's also a recognition of the fact that obviously those people can interact, right? Like the kid's mom and dad also have their own relationship, and they might also have friends at the school, or have interactions with the neighbors, or interactions with the teachers, and that's all interacting, and that the kids being exposed to media, but so are the kids' parents. And so like there's this recognition of this relationship between microsystem and the connection between the contexts. That's a good way of saying it. Connections between contexts, the connections between family and school and kid, and all this kind of stuff. And like, for example, yeah, children who have parents who reject or neglect them may have difficulty forming relationships at school. So if you're just looking at it as the kid having trouble at school and not noticing how like the parenting at home is playing a role, you're potentially misinterpreting the situation, right? And so this Bronfenbrenner's models, actually, like the more I think about it and talk about it, the more you can kind of see the depth of how this is showing how people, one of the things that's unique about you is how this unique model would apply to your life. That like you're this unique person biophysically, and also psychologically, and also spiritually, and also in your immediate relationships, and also in how those relationships interact in all these different ways that shape your world. And then there's a relationship between the microsystems, between the family and the church and the neighborhood and the peers in school. So another interesting aspect of this is like in the ecosystem. So he also had this idea, uh, to say, for example, like the example I have there, that like the home experience may be influenced by a parent's work experience. Like obviously if a parent has a job that they hate and that's super negative and it makes them super negative, that's going to have an influence on how they are as parents. So even though that kid never goes to that place of work, that place of work influences their life. See what I mean? It's like if your dad influences your life big time, and there's something in your dad's life that totally stresses him out and interferes with his ability to help you, then you could say that that thing's influencing your life at this like ecosystem level. This link between social settings where even though that kid might not obviously be an employee there, the way that place is shaping the dad is influencing the kid. And in addition to that, there's this idea of macro systems, or this idea that like not only that, but the kid and the microsystem and how all those are interacted in the mesosystem, and then the ecosystem. Again, the language is, well, language is actually really in some ways good, because micro means small, meso means between, eco means I think like context, basically like the environment, macro means big, and then chrono means time. So actually, I guess and they're all systems. So even though it's like it takes a while to get your head around, once you get your head around it, it actually is pretty clear that there's like there's like who you are, and then there's the small system around you, and then there's how those systems interact, those close systems around you, the mesosystem, and then that exists within all those people that you know, like all those peers also have their worlds, and all the people at your school also like have their parents at home, and it's like you could even take that idea like your peers at school are going to be influenced how they how they interact with like how a kid's friends at school interact with that kid are going to be influenced by how those kids' friends' home lives are, right? If you followed me there, you worked hard because I made that example confusing. But basically, just this idea that obviously, like if a kid's having a rough home life, that's going to shape or have an effect on them at school, and that's happening to everybody. Everybody's having their own influences from these kind of ecosystems that like are kind of hard to pin down, but it's just like saying that not everyone's neutral in these situations. We all are bringing a lot to the table. So then the last piece of this model sort of that I want to touch on is the chronosystem idea, right? And that this is that the pattern of environment events or transitions over a life course, and meaning that like not only is your experience in your microsystem and mesosystem and ecosystem and macrosystem and basically like your layers of your social reality and all that stuff kind of uniquely yours, it's also like kind of captured in this unique period of time. That's why I have like obviously the spike protein pictures, like you live through this pandemic piece, it's like that is a variable also. It's a social historical condition in a sense on your lifespan development. So it's like all these factors and also when it's happening. Good old Maslow. It's like if Freud's the father of psychology, you gotta say Maslow's kind of like the grandfather of psychology. And it's a weird thing to say, but what I mean by that is like, I don't know, by all accounts I've read, it seems like Maslow was a pretty good guy, and it's like really valued family and was a sort of traditional person in the sense of like take care of the people around you, take care of what's important. And anyways, I think he's interesting. This is an interesting quote, right? If you deliberately plan on being less than you're capable of being, then I warn you that you'll be unhappy for the rest of your life. That actually this like that limiting your own growth can be suffocating almost. And so I wanted to use this to get into Maslow, because I know you've seen the hierarchy of needs before, and I'm going to touch on it because I have some things to say about it, but I understand that this is probably not the first time you've seen this. But that, again, it's like just because I worry sometimes that because some of these things get presented in like little easy to show in one slide models, that the depth can be missed. Because this is actually a really intense idea that Maslow has. So in response, and just to kind of go to what I was saying, right, that like there's a depth to this that's really important to highlight, that Maslow's saying that like you're never reaching those high-end needs unless you meet the lower ones, right? Like a kid that's sitting in school worried about where his next meal's coming from. It's very hard for them to do something like establish self-esteem or meet any of the growth-based needs like developing their higher self or anything like that. That's almost like ridiculous talk to somebody that's like fearing for their safety, right? So he thought that like there's certain things that he called the deficiency needs that like you yearn for them if you lack them. like physiological needs, and you've heard probably someone explain this model to you before, right? Like, so physiological or anything related to your physical body, so like food and going to the bathroom and air and water, right? There's certain needs that your body has. Then there's certain kind of safety needs. And all this is like so interesting because like I could go on rants about all this stuff. Because like what, especially just if you even just for a second think about the last few years, and how should I say it? Almost in some ways an attack on people's sense of psychological safety. And then trying to think how to finish this sentence because I'm like, because really, if you think about it, it's a challenging thought, right? That like it stagnates everything. Basically, if people are constantly in this worry state, like there's no belonging, self-esteem, like actually caring about the beauty and things. Like it's like all that stuff is like all those growth-based needs are almost out of reach when the worry is constantly about psychological safety and security, whether real or imagined. And then belongingness and love needs and esteem needs. But then there's like, and this is where like if we were going super deep on this topic, and we will at some point, I'd bring in like Harry Harlow, right? And Harlow does his research with the monkeys and makes the point that like love is possibly a physiological need, and attention might be actually a physiological need, and actually the mind might break down without that. It might not be like, oh, it's nice to have. It's like actually a need, right? And this is what his research with the rhesus monkeys. So, anyways, I'm just rambling about this hierarchy, but it's actually like super interesting, and like this idea that you sort of there's deficiency needs. So there's like the things that like without you experience as a lacking, right? A deficiency, not enough, not a sufficient amount, a deficient amount. And then the idea is that like if there's lackings in the blue deficiency needs, you're never getting to the yellow, like you're not getting to like some of these higher, or at least it's incredibly hindered. And so this is one of Maslow's ideas, right? Is that like things can hinder this self-actualizing tendency that people in like, and I have Rogers there too because he had similar ideas, and Rogers is like probably the most important psychologist in shaping what we now consider counseling, and this whole idea of like person-centered or like focused on the role of the therapist and stuff like that. That's all like Carl Rogers, like who you are as the therapist matters as much as the theory that you use. That's Carl Rogers. And this is all coming from this like humanistic perspective. And honestly, like if you're somebody that's interested in getting into counseling or anything like that in the future, you should become well familiar with Carl Rogers. He has a book called On Becoming, like on this, what does it mean to like become a better version of yourself or whatever. On Becoming is just the name of the book. But it's this idea that like, oh yeah, I was gonna say that like, whereas Maslow has this idea of self-actualization, right? That like, how can you take your full potential and switch it from potential to something that's actually real, right? And turning your potential into something that's actually real is actualizing it, making it an actual thing. Actualizing your highest version of self. Self-actualization is like not just what you could be, but actually being what you could be. I think that's a decent way of saying it. And then Rogers' idea was like fully functioning, that you can become like, if there was like the best way you could handle interactions, and the best way you could handle your behavior, and the best way you could handle your self-talk, and the best way you could handle your whatever, it's like you could become the best version of yourself. And he called that like fully functioning. You're like So almost like where self-actualization to me almost has more of a kind of psychological, almost spiritual aspect. It's like to Rogers, he was very self to be like fully functional, to be the most functional. Notice that word is like such a strong word. Functional means like your ability to do things, to function, to actually like if your computer is functioning correctly, it's working. If it's not functioning correctly, it's dysfunctional. If a society is not functioning correctly, it's dysfunctional. Dysfunctional means not working. That's what Rogers thought happened to people, right? They got into situations that were dysfunctional, that weren't working. And he thought it was often because there's an incongruence, is his word, or this disconnect between you're saying you want this, but you're acting in a way as if you value these other things, and that disconnect is a huge part of the problem. It's a lack of congruence. It's a lack of kind of authentic realness and acceptance of your actual life. Rogers has the classic quote that like actually I think it's like the quote is like the paradox of change is that as soon as you recognize that you're okay, and as soon as you accept yourself as yourself, then you can change. As soon as you're able to accept yourself as yourself, then you're in a position for growth. So you see there this like idea that behavior intrinsically motivated towards self-improvement, that there's a this is like a axiom would be the word. An axiom is like a statement that's like definitional of their theoretical perspective, right? Like so for psychoanalysis it'd be that unconscious influences affect your behavior and emotions. For behavioralism it would be that like behavior is understanding behavior is key to understanding humans, and that behavior can be conditioned. The humanistic approach is based on this idea that there actually is this like self-actualizing tendency, or whatever you want to call it. You could call it like, you know, Franco calls it self-transcendence. A lot of them have their own word for it, but it's like it basically means this idea of like becoming the best version of yourself. Or see, because I just messed myself up by mentioning Franco, because he comes in at even a deeper level and he says like actually the only self-actualization, because he was a fan of Maslow, like he was respecting Maslow, but he said that like you'll never get self-actualization without self-transcendence. And what he meant was that like you can't try to be the best version of yourself. You have to get to a point where you're so naturally being yourself that you're not even trying, and then you might actually self-actualize, that you can't actually aim directly at it. It's like he has this like really interesting point that it's like you can't be just a real person, but you can stop being a fake person. It's like you can stop being inauthentic. And it's like it's this philosophy of negation, that you become what you are, and negation is actually it's apotheotic knowledge. It's like negation's a branch of philosophy that says that you find your true self by finding everything that you're not, and what remains is the true self. 10 minutes on this slide. I'm sorry. But I don't know. I hope you find this. I've said this like 3 times this class, but I hope that you find this interesting. Like, it's you know, learn from these people and then make it your own, and then it's like the Bruce Lee thing, like discard what's useless and keep what's useful. And like there's a lot of knowledge here that like you can I don't know what I'm trying to say, that you can integrate into your own understanding of yourself and of the people around you and of your social world and of the people that you're going to work with in the future. And so I have a couple more. I wanted you to write this down. I had a couple more points to make. I kind of already ranted about this, but like this idea that your body's trying to monitor, and like homeostasis is like almost this like high school biology word of like trying to reestablish balance, and like that your body has this, well, has all these rhythms and all these processes that are trying to maintain, and like our physiological needs are fundamental for survival, and our body is innately focused on those, and when those needs aren't being met, it interferes with other things, right? So physiological needs, like the need of food and drink and air and those things we had talked about before, sexuality, the need to go to the bathroom, which is kind of interesting that that's at that level, because obviously if somehow that was prevented, you would die of blood poisoning, right? So it's again a kind of brutal thought, but it's part of reality, of nature, I guess. Okay, so I'll move on to the next part. And so like the thing I wanted to kind of highlight again is just this like relationship between deficiency needs and being needs. And I think this is one thing that like Maslow is really interesting about, that like, yeah, like if we're lacking in psychological safety, and this is what I find so interesting, it's like Maslow knew this. Look at that second point. If those needs aren't met, we're more vulnerable to depression and anxiety. It's like if you take that point deep, it's if people don't feel psychologically safe, if they don't feel like their physical needs are met, if they don't feel like people around them care about them and give a crap, then those higher level growth needs become almost out of reach. And so if we're actually worried about like developing and getting the most out of kids, or getting the most out of kids, that's just another way of saying self-actualizing, right? What does getting the most out of mean? That the kid has potential, and that if they were in the right situation, if they were in a zone of proximal development, maybe they would self-actualize. So just a couple last points I want to make. So this is one of the more recent branches of psychology to really kind of take hold, and this is based largely off Seligman's work, but also off people like Csikszentmihalyi, who the guy that created the flow idea. If you look around on this site, you'll see that I taught a course for Nipissing last year called Positive Psychology, and I have a presentation on positive psychology, and then I have the next presentation in that course is on existentialism, and I make the point in that class that positive psychology is really like an extension of a lot of existential ideas. And so it's like newer as like this specific kind of system of psychological thought, but it's philosophically based on a lot of solid tradition. And it's basically this idea of PERMA, right? So PERMA says that actually like positive psychology, and I know you've probably heard of it, and you've probably seen Seligman's TED Talk specifically, right? Because that's like, he's like the famous name associated with this. He was the head of the APA for a while, and like he was, he's a big name, and he has this like interesting idea, right? And I think some of it's like again, I was kind of making the point, it's like a repackaging of existentialism, but it's still important. And he's saying this idea that, like, for most of the history of psychology, we viewed psychology as something that is used to help people that are, if you look at like kind of living a good life, people that are like struggling, and to get them back to like normal. But Seligman's idea is that like psychology can be used for much more than that, and it can be used. Sorry, I don't mean to yawn on you, but it's like getting after 11. It's just been a long day. I love doing this, but yeah, sorry, yawn snuck out there. But that like as you're getting, but that you can actually use psychology to foster positive growth in people's lives and to like improve their life. And this is the idea of positive psychology, that you can increase the amount of positive emotion and the amount of like meaningful psychological engagement and the amount of like important relationships of actual quality and depth and trust, and the actual amount of meaningful purpose and, you know, meaningful purpose, and just like feeling that things actually matter and that you're doing things that have some kind of value, and that you're like focusing on realistic goals and balancing these competing demands. Because the whole thing is like, it's a fight against meaninglessness, it's a fight against nihilism. And this is where it's an extension of existentialism, because like this was Nietzsche's big warning, right? That like he worried that when people became less religious, they would start treating politics as religion, and the inherent emptiness of politics would make people nihilistic, right? And if you, that's basically like, if you said F it to everything and made that a philosophy, that's basically nihilism. Nothing matters. And the humanistic psychologists viewed that and Nietzsche viewed that as a cancerous philosophy, and actually as one of the greatest threats to civilization. And that, well, Nietzsche thought that you had to make meaning. Another one of my big influences was Carl Jung, and Carl Jung thought that you had to look back into your ancestors' past and find what was meaningful to them, because that has some like deep connection to your soul, almost. Like Carl Jung and Nietzsche are like, talk about heavyweights. But they were both worried with this question, right? Like, what happens to people when you strip away religion? Because like religion, and specifically in the West, Christianity not dominated, but provided a conceptual framework for how people understood everything. So like, and then if all of a sudden people have this religious impulse and they think that they're atheist, but then they just get religious about their politics, right? Nietzsche was saying this before World War One, even. Like, he was saying this, like Nietzsche sort of predicted World War One and Two, right? Not like in a Nostradamus way, but he said that, like, he famously said like God is dead, and this isn't like that's like the most misused quote of all time. But he says that like God is dead and the philosophers killed him, and there's not enough water to wash away the blood that will come. It's like he wasn't basking in joy about it. Anyways, I'm getting like, all now of a sudden it's like, man, I wanted to be a little more focused on these last slides, and I'm all of a sudden talking to you about Nietzsche. I'll keep going, but yeah, PERMA. It actually has a great depth, and its depth comes from how it's an applied extension of existential thought. Because one of the problems with some of the existential thinkers is they're like so deep about stuff, and they get to such a deep level, but there's a depressed vibe to it that like is understandable but not necessarily always helpful when looking to turn that into an applied lifestyle practice. And I think PERMA is an interesting response to the existential demand for a more meaningful, engaged relationship with your life and with other people in your world. So I find this idea fascinating, and this is going to be the last idea. And then I just have like a thanks slide, or like a end of chapter 1 slide. Thanks for watching after this. Learning is connected to the physical experience, that as you use tools, as you manipulate your environment largely with your hands, it actually is shaping your brain. That there's an interaction, this self-organizing, think of what that word means. Self-organizing relationship and interaction between the nervous system, the body, and the environment. And that's how we make sense of the world. That it's so wild, like what your nervous system is, even, right? That your nervous system is that which feels. It's what, when something touches you, it's what noticed it, that something touched you. It's what's making sense of the world. And that, like, this is very similar to actually Piaget's idea of sensory motor, that like when my daughter's learning to walk, it's like this complicated interaction between her nervous system, her like body, obviously your nervous system's in your body, but when I say body there, it kind of mean like the muscles and the skeleton and all that, and like her like psychological perception with that world. And because it's like that dynamic interaction, and because it's all these things, and because she has all this potential to learn this, that there's this ability for spontaneity and novelty, or basically of doing new and unique things. It's not like a pre-programmed computer that can only do like 17 things. It's like, no, like a human baby actually has this like incredible range. And as we like, yeah, and this is interesting, right? It's like phase transitions. That's a cool word. So if you're like this and then you move to another level, phase transition means that, okay, so say if I say you're a level 2 and then I say, okay, now you're a level 3. Well, what switched you from a level 2 to a level 3? What was the specific phase transition? Like an example from today's presentation would be something like I said, like one kind of common way we talk about a phase transition out of infancy is like when the baby starts like talking or walking. Those are like kind of signs that now the infant's becoming a toddler, at least just in like common speak, right? So phase transition is an interesting word, where the point of instability and turbulence leads to a new level of complexity, this transition to a new phase or new level or a new stage. Yeah, this Thean's work, and we'll talk about it in different contexts, but it's like really relevant in terms of like motor skill learning and child development. So we'll come back to this dynamic systems theory. All right, I got a bit ranty at some points, and sorry, I had to do this in two videos, not 2 takes. Yeah, right, 2 takes. Maybe 2 takes on this slide, but thanks for bearing with me. I think once I get I haven't recorded a video in quite a while, as you can tell if you look around on the site. Obviously, I made those like syllabus review videos and like a couple little things, but a full lecture I haven't done for a few months, so I'm kind of, that was fun to get into, and I'm gonna actually over the next few days start turning my attention to the next one so that I can catch up quick. Because yeah, like I was saying, it's important to me, and I think that like I've over the years really gotten a lot from my interaction with Nipsing students, and I want to have you ready and able to engage this content. And so like I'm gonna start working on chapter 2, then I think in week 3 I'm gonna give you your first assignment, the first digital workshop. All right, take care, my friends. See you soon. Cheers.